Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here with you today. I guess the work that we've been doing at diesel exhaust at BHP is really, I guess, why I became an occupational physician. My career started off as many doctors does in the, working in the hospitals, and I thought I would become a cardiologist or a respiratory specialist or something along those lines, and I didn't really understand occupational medicine at all. But I found it really difficult dealing with dying patients, and I was looking for other avenues for me. And I decided that a public health and preventative approach was really something which I really resonated with. And our ability to work in a company like BHP and undertake preventative health on a scale which initially was just internal, but as I go through the presentation, show you the opportunity to have an impact on a global scale is really what sort of motivates me to get out of bed every day. And I'm very grateful for working with a company such as BHP, which supports this work, which is so important. If I can suggest, my aim is to try to get through the presentation in no more than 15 minutes. And then provide 10 or so minutes for questions. There is a bit of content to get through, so do you mind if there are any questions, perhaps sort of write them down so you don't forget them, and then we'll provide an opportunity to go through those questions at the end. So with that, the presentation today, a little overview of who BHP is, why we've made the decision to manage diesel exhaust as low as technically feasible, what actions we've taken then to align with that commitment, and then where we see the future going. And we'll open up for questions following on from that. So from a BHP perspective, many of you may know BHP. We're a global resources company, a workforce of more than 72,000 people, 4 main commodities in the area of iron ore, copper, metallurgical coal for steel making, and oil and gas. Our predominant workforces are in Australia. Probably 60% of our workforce, I'd say, would be in Australia. South America would be sort of 20%. US maybe 10% supporting the oil and gas business. And then we've got some commercial services and some support services through Asia. I'll just draw your attention to the sustainability performance on the right-hand side of the slide there. You'll see there under people that we've achieved a 50% reduction in exposures against our most material agents. And our most material agents are respirable silica, coal mine dust, and diesel exhaust. And that's since 2017. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. But our public targets are one of our really important levers, I guess, we've got to pull upon to drive improved performance in the health arena. In terms of, I guess, a governance structure within BHP, similar to most all other organisations, we have what we call our charter values, which really are our North Star in terms of the way that we think about our work. We prioritise our work and the decisions that we make. And really importantly is the first charter value of sustainability, which is putting health and safety first, being environmentally responsible and supporting our communities. And that really underpins absolutely everything that we do. And importantly, from our perspective, although it's fair to say that the S is larger than the H in HS&E, H is not insignificant, and certainly we get very, very strong leadership support. Very briefly, in terms of our framework, so we've got our charter values, we've then got our corporate standards, and they'll be important, and I'll talk about those in a minute. We've got reporting to our leadership team of leading and lagging indicators, and one of our really important reporting in terms of leading indicators to the board is our number of workers that are exposed to agents that exceed our occupational exposure levels. So they pay very close attention to that. We've also got what we call our global strategic positions and maturity curves, which really sort of map out our 5-year plan. and something which is certainly not all mining companies have got key performance indicators tied to long-term health public targets, but we certainly do, and it's something that's been in place for the last 8 years, and those targets are tied to exposure reduction, and it's something which I think is I guess in a sector such as mining, which is very cyclical. There are the good times, there are the bad times. There's certainly, I feel there could be a risk if we didn't have those longer-term 5-year targets tied to, key performance indicators. Potentially during the bad times, we might take our foot off the gas a little bit as far as ongoing investment in our exposure reduction projects. We might sort of say, look, that's something we can put off for a couple of years until our commodity prices recover. But the fact that we do say that this is really, really important, it is tied to performance indicators, means that through the good times and the bad times, we continue to invest in exposure reduction. So what I want to talk about now is the setting of internal occupational exposure limits. And within our company standards, we mandate exposure levels. And the reason we've done that is really twofold. The first is, I'm sure many of you would recognise that the science continues to evolve. Our understanding of exposure science continues to evolve, but regulations lag far behind. And if any of you are in Australia now, you'll be aware that Safe Work Australia is undertaking its first comprehensive review of occupational exposure levels in more than 20 years. So very much a risk if we relied solely on regulatory limits. There may well be very compelling scientific evidence that there's a significantly greater risk associated with regulatory limits than was once believed. And so we believe that would be placing our workers to unacceptable risk. The other piece, in a global company, if we were to default simply to the local regulatory limits, potentially that could be perceived that you were willing to accept a differing level of risk for workers in one company, in one country compared to the next. It's not unusual for regulatory limits to be twofold or even 4- or 5-fold different between regulatory regimes. This doesn't hang true for all exposures, but certainly for some, that may well mean that you're willing to accept a fatal risk due to a carcinogen exposure, which is 5 times greater in one jurisdiction than another. So I think that's something which also needs to be considered. So we established a process of continuous monitoring of the science, benchmarking of regulators and OEO setting bodies, as well as benchmarking with peers and independent expert review triggers when certain thresholds were crossed. So from a diesel perspective, what's been our journey there? In 2012, the IARC classification came into place. And we had an independent review at that stage of the science. At that stage, the conclusion came back that, yes, the IARC decision, compelling evidence sitting behind it, but not the published studies available to inform dose response curves, which we use for the setting of OELs. However, from a precautionary perspective, we required controls to start to be implemented at 50% of the then exposure ROEL of 0.1 milligrams per metre cubed. In 2014, a really important paper came out by an author by Broadmeadow, and he looked at 3 studies, one of which was the diesel exhaust in miners study, which was a NIOSH-sponsored study in the US, and 2 trucker studies. Through that, he combined those exposure response calculations and came up with the first time I'd actually seen a dose response curve for diesel exhaust, which was certainly suggesting an elevated cancer risk at levels of exposure significantly lower than current OELs. That led to a second review by Professor Tim Driscoll, a world-leading expert in occupational exposure epidemiology. He reviewed the papers, believed that they were sufficiently sound, methodologically valid, from which to inform dose response curves. From there, we went to the Institute of Occupational Medicine. They're a UK-based organisation based out of Edinburgh and have done a lot of work for the UK governments and the EU governments in recommending OELs. And they undertook a review of the Newland paper and independently the 3 studies that informed it. From that work, they believe that 2 of the 3 studies were useful for informing dose response curves. There was the Garship Truckers study as well as the diesel exhaust and miner study. They combined those 2 results and came up with their own dose response curve. And from that, the basic conclusion was, look, we can't really see a safe level of exposure to diesel exhaust, and in fact, recommend to, rather than setting a specific occupational exposure level, to look to seek to manage diesel exhaust to as low as technically feasible. So, see what you can do this year, see how technology evolves, continue to try to push and drive exposures down over time, and we accepted that work. I might just skip through there, but just point out that we did in fact make available that review by the Institute of Occupational Medicine, and happy to share that via Kevin if people would be interested to see it. So what's BHP's position? First of all, we always seek independent expert advice to inform our position. We don't think we should be doing that in isolation. We think it's always more transparent and got greater credibility if we use external expertise to inform us. As I said, our commitment is to manage diesel exhaust to as low as technically feasible. Our current exposure target is 30 micrograms per metre cubed compared to the regulatory requirement of 100, and we're currently going through the process of determining what might be our next targeted level for exposures. And we're absolutely committed to sharing our experience. So what have we managed to achieve during that period of time? Look, we've currently got 3 underground operations, which is our focus for our diesel exposure reduction work. We've got a coal mine in Queensland. We've got a predominantly copper mine, but also it's polymetalliferous with gold, silver, and uranium at Olympic Dam. We've got a nickel mine at Cliffs, and we've got a project in development in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, for potash. Look, no surprise in terms of what our approach is to managing diesel exhaust. We follow the hierarchy of control, but ultimately where we're looking to get to is to have zero emission equipment, and I'll talk about that in terms of what currently is available to us in that area, but also where we see the future going. No real surprises going, swapping out lower tier for higher tier engines, where necessary, putting on aftermarket filtration, focusing on ventilation, looking at fuels and lubricants, which can make a significant difference. Emissions-based maintenance regimes are very, very important, and that was one of our most important early controls. And where needed with higher exposures, we do have respiratory protective requirements in place. Look, I didn't want to go into a whole lot of detail, recognising that we don't have a lot of time in terms of the specifics across all of our operations, but I just did want to give a couple of examples of where we have seen significant improvements. So this was some tailpipe emission measurements that were undertaken, and on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see what was coming out of the tailpipe under, using the standard filters that were in place on some load haul and dump equipment at our underground mine in Broadmeadow. And then on the left-hand side was doing some collaborative work with Hyno, the very significant reduction in exposures that occurred with that particular piece of equipment, and that became a very important part of our strategy at Broadmeadow, was changing out the filters that were in place. The other area that I wanted to talk about was our work undertaking, looking for opportunities for zero emissions equipment. And in Australia, this is relatively immature in the mining sector as compared to what's occurring in Canada, where I know there's a lot more activity in terms of looking at zero emission equipment. But we've currently got 2 pilots occurring, one at our Broadmeadow mine and one at our Olympic Dam mine. Both are going very, very successfully in terms of the performance, the duty cycles, and both the drivers and the workers themselves love the equipment in terms of how smooth it is, how quiet it is, the absence of emissions. One of the particular challenges I just want to point out for in Broadmeadow being a coal mine is that there is the risk of methane gas, and therefore the risk of the risk of ignition sources needs to be adequately controlled. And there's quite a lot of work we need to do to enable battery electric equipment to be able to go underground. And currently our electric vehicles are only available in some parts of the mine, but not in the high risk areas. But it'd be fair to say the regulatory regime in place for battery electric vehicles in Queensland Coal is pretty outdated. It's very much based on the old lead batteries rather than the newer nickel-based batteries, which we believe are significantly safer and got different tolerance levels. So we're working with the regulator to be successful in that area. Importantly, when we're looking at our potash mine, they have very much embraced our target of as low as technically feasible, and currently at this point in time, more than 90% of energy sources required to operate underground at potash will be emissions-free equipment, so battery or tethered electrical, which is outstanding. Just wanted to share with you, so what have we managed to achieve during that period of time? You can see this is at our Olympic Dam mine. The orange line you can see is 0.03, which is what our occupational exposure level is, and you can see the reductions that we've achieved with the darker green line being 2017 and the exposures at the end of 2018. So there's been some significant reductions at our Olympic Dam mine. When you look at Broadmeadow, it's a different way of portraying the information, but each of those orange dots are the results, that's representing the personal monitoring that has been performed across our Broadmeadow mine since 2013. And you can see back in early 2013 some very, very high levels of exposure. They were frequently associated with longwall moves when we had a lot of equipment underground moving the longwall. But you can see that blue line is the average exposures. That's the 95th upper confidence level for the production development seg, which is one of our higher exposed segs. And you can see as we're getting towards 2017 and 2018, all of those personal monitoring results are well under 30 micrograms per metre cube. So that had a really outstanding level of exposure reduction during that period of time. This is just a different way of showing it in terms of the numbers of workers with exposures that exceed our exposure level of 0.03. Again, recognising that the regulatory standard is 0.1 milligrams per metre cubed. At Broadmeadow, you'll see 2017, there were about 350 workers exposed. 2018, there were 0 workers exposed. And in 2019, there were 50 workers exposed. Look, those 50 workers reflect activities that were occurring during a period of about 4 weeks when we're undertaking a longwall move. So we've still got some challenges associated with longwall moves to be maintaining exposures below 0.03 because of the high number of diesel equipment that are underground required to move all of the longwall into the new development area. So that's an ongoing challenge for us. You can see what's been happening at Olympic Dam. And Nickel West, the exposure reduction hasn't been that significant, and the reason for that is that mine is in fact due for closure at the end of 2020, and so there hasn't been the same level of effort that's been in place as the other mines, which is understandable. Instead, there's been exposure reductions where possible, but a stronger reliance on respiratory protective equipment underground to protect those workers. Look, in the remaining couple of minutes, what I just want to do, I won't talk about Jansen, I won't talk about challenges. I do want to bring your attention to the International Council of Mining and Metals Innovation for Cleaner, Safer Vehicles. This is something that BHP has been a very strong advocate for, a very strong sponsor of, and is playing a very key role we worked with ICMM to get this idea to fruition, and have continued to support it by having our CEO as the chair of the CEO Advisory Committee. We've got one of our asset presidents as chair of the steering committee. We've also got the chair of the greenhouse gas working group and a lead participant in the diesel particulate working group as well. And although the statement there under diesel exhaust doesn't perhaps sort of sound that ambitious, promoting operation technological innovations to minimise the impacts to underground mining from emissions to diesel particulate matter, it is in fact mapping out, developing a roadmap beyond 2025 that will enable diesel-free mining underground. And this has only been in place for about 12 months, but we're already seeing significant changes in the thinking of both smaller and major equipment suppliers over the need to accelerate the availability of battery electric vehicles underground. And that's very much been because there is now sort of united voice from the mining sector, sending a very strong signal to the original equipment manufacturers that this is the direction that we need to go. And as recently as a couple of weeks ago, we had one of the major OEMs who previously hadn't shown as much interest in developing battery electric equipment coming to us and very much wanting to partner with us to trial some of their larger load haul and dump vehicles, which they're keen to enable to become battery electric, which is very, very exciting. So, look, I might stop there. We're certainly starting to see some regulatory interest in diesel exhaust. The Queensland Department of Mines is suggesting targets of 0.05 and 0.03. The WA government funded study is suggesting an OEL of 35, and Health Council of Netherlands is calling out very, very significant health risks at low levels of exposure. So we are starting to see some regulatory shifts there. I won't go through what the journals are saying, other than perhaps to say, look, there continues to be some vocal critics of the risks associated with diesel exhaust. Whenever they come through, I do ask our independent experts to review and evaluate those. And essentially, the advice back to us is that the weight of evidence and the power of the studies that we're using continue to outweigh the criticisms which are coming through from some of the critics. So I'm very convinced that we're doing the right thing, and there's sufficient evidence for us to be acting in this particular way. So look, I might stop there, Kevin. I've went a little bit longer than I said. I'm happy to take questions for the next 5 minutes, but then unfortunately I do have to go to a meeting which I'm chairing.